Hello and welcome everybody to the Virtual Science Cafe, brought to you by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for tuning in tonight to our cafe event every week at 7 o'clock Thursday nights right here on the internet. We've been bringing you our ever popular Science Cafe series where we meet guest speakers, experts in their field, who talk a little bit to us about their passions, their knowledge, insight, and expertise. And then we give you the chance to ask your questions. Throughout the presentation tonight, leave your questions and comments over in the chat box or the comments box there if you're watching on Facebook, and we'll be posing those to our guest speaker at the end of the presentation. So do that for us. We want you to engage. We want to know what you want to know about tonight's topic. And tonight we're talking about coffee and conservation. That's right. In fact, I went just for tonight, decided to have a nice hot cup, just to get in the mood, right? Because let's be real, there's not many of us who don't like coffee, right? If you don't like coffee, you don't have to out yourself in the chat box. But if you do like coffee, just like drop a coffee cup emoji over there for me. Okay. Now, that means I'm going to be extra fired up for the Q&A later. That's what that means. Announcements. I do want to make a quick announcement before I introduce our guest, and that is that we would like your feedback. We've done, I think this is our 10th Virtual Science Cafe now, and we want to know what you think of the virtual series. So there's a link that should be popping up down here on the screen. Scribble that down, visit the link, and fill out that survey form for us. Give us your opinions, give us your insights into the show, because we want to make sure that we're giving you the best science content that we can here at NCMNS. Now, let's get on with tonight's show. My guest tonight is Dr. Jaime Collazo. He is a professor of animal ecology at NC State University and somebody who's spent quite a bit of time, I think, thinking about not only coffee, but the implications of having to grow coffee and produce coffee for all of us who like to drink it. Dr. Collazo, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate it. Glad to be here tonight.
So glad that you could join us. How are things in your part of North Carolina?
Quiet. I mean, like everybody, staying home pretty much, except when absolutely necessary. And when we go out, take all the necessary precautions. So what we're doing tonight, I'm sure everybody would have loved to be in person at the museum, but given circumstances, it is the safe way. And we still accomplish our objective, and that is to engage in an interchange of ideas and conversation. So we're on the money. Not bad.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, the only thing that I think we're missing in that case is the Daily Planet Cafe itself, where we normally host our programs. You know, all of our viewers can't get up, hit the coffee bar, and come back with an espresso for the show tonight. But otherwise, yeah, we're going to do some learning tonight, and I'm excited to see what you've got to teach us and engage us with. So, everybody, please welcome Dr. Jaime Collazo.
All right. Again, tonight I'm talking about conservation design, and I want to illustrate this with a case study I've been working on for several years in Puerto Rico, and with a focal, with an emphasis on coffee cultivation. And I was saying that conservation design, a definition, would be a process that identifies opportunities to protect species, habitats, and environmental processes across landscapes. And a simple way to put it is, what is conservation design? Is, well, the decision process is to decide where do we put things or actions to achieve a conservation objective. As an example, you know, what if you got X amount of dollars, a hefty amount, and you were asked to create protected habitat? You can do multiple, you can have multiple options, but here I illustrate 4 of them. One here on the top left, expand an existing reserve, which is the dark green, and then you're expanding, and you can expand it in different ways. Another one is that you can create a reserve, protected habitat across a gradient, stay high elevation to low elevation, therefore capture as much biological diversity as possible. And the other one is, in this particular case, is to expand and create other islands, habitats, so that you don't put all your eggs, if you will, in one reserve. And the one I want to draw attention to is this one. This one is that you have the two reserve, and we create habitats in between. And in doing so, we facilitate movement back and forth throughout this whole landscape. So in a sense, we have increased the permeability, or the ability for animals to move across this habitat matrix, which may be, for example, dominated by ag lands, this white stuff here, or urban, or a mix of urban and ag lands. So the idea here, again, is to facilitate movement between protected areas. Geography, as I said, a refresher. Puerto Rico is the smallest and the easternmost of the Greater Antilles. To the west, Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, and then Jamaica. We are about 2 hours flight from Miami and about 3 hour flight from RDU, and pretty much the same thing from Atlanta. So why conservation design? Why bother? Yeah, well, one major reason is that we dominate landscapes. And I'm illustrating here a land cover map of Puerto Rico, which dates back to 2000. And I brought it up simply because it illustrates the complexity and the number of different land uses on the island. The red part is urbanized habitats. For those of you familiar with the island, here's the eastern part of the island. That's the Caribbean National Forest, or Yunque National Forest, as it's now called. And today we're going to spend most of our talk in this west central part of the island, which is high elevation habitat dominated by forested lands, several reserves, but coffee or agricultural land use. So we'll go back to that in a few minutes. So this footprint that we have on the landscape creates a number of challenges. So let's call them realities and opportunities. So the reality is that not all species respond similarly. Some are adapters, and you can think of your backyard birds, your cardinals, your catbirds, your wrens. They don't mind being sticking around your house, and bird feeders and nest boxes and what have you. But there are others that are the avoiders, and those are really the worrisome ones. They're usually our habitat specialists, and so it creates the need to protect habitat or somehow manage habitat to keep them around, persist them over time. The other reality is that we cannot go about conservation by just buying our way out. It's just too expensive, and we cannot buy or keep up with the needs to achieve that. Fortunately, and this is where I enter into opportunities, we can achieve desirable conservation outcomes by managing or restoring habitat. This is not a novel concept, but it's certainly one that is catching up in the conservation community, conservation agencies, etc. The key is to integrate these selected land uses, because it's not every land use is appropriate for it, into conservation strategies. So the example that I'm using for Puerto Rico, I had the head of the conservation agency, the state conservation agency in Puerto Rico, asked me to put together a pilot project, a model project, to illustrate how we can go about landscapes and increase the conservation value of it. There are two areas that she was particularly interested in, and that is enhancing ecological services, and these are benefits that human accrue or get from a healthy ecosystem. For instance, clean water, recreational opportunities for birding, but even things like healthy population of pollinators, so that we have the food that we can eat, including coffee. The other one is that we want to hang on to the species that are providing those services. So that's what we call species persistence. We want to do whatever we can to hang on to them for 50, 100 years, 200 years. The caveat on her request to me was that there was no funding for acquisition. Therefore, the hefty dollars that you guys got in the illustration I gave you early on in the talk was not applicable to me. So we need to work with other means to achieve our objective. So that's turned my attention to what we call agroforestry. And I have down there, and I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but I'll read the definition. It's and this definition is from the USDA NRCS. So the land management system that blends agriculture and forestry to enhance productivity and profits. So we take care of the landowner, the farmer, but also enhances environmental stewardship. And so we create a win-win situation where if we are smart enough and we sell it right, then farmers would participate in such initiatives. We have to keep in mind that all of this is voluntary. None of this is mandated in any way, shape, or form. In Puerto Rico, this comes, agroforestry is basically sun and it's coffee. In no pun intended. We don't have cacao to speak of. That's more in Central America and South America. But in Puerto Rico, we have the Shadegrown coffee, which, as the name implies, you have a layer of canopy trees. It could include, like you see here, banana trees, citrus fruits, and other cash crops. And down below, you have the coffee bushes. You can appreciate pretty much what it looks like if you had the cover. There is an area that was clear to plant the coffee bushes, and you see the rows. Down below, I show one of the sort of downsides of sun-grown coffee. On the one hand, you have higher productivity. It usually doesn't last for too long. Part of it is because you lose the topsoil, as you can see here. Especially if you're sloping terrain, you'll lose that topsoil in essentially 2, 3, 4 years, and you have to compensate with agrochemicals, and that's when it starts getting a little bit dicey for the growers and for consumers. The appeal of coffee is also because it's a worldwide commodity. As you can see here, along the tropical band worldwide, you have Indonesia, Southeast Asia, you have Central Africa, you have South America. Look here at the top, you have Brazil, Colombia, but also we have Mesoamerica or Middle America here, Central America, and then the Caribbean. We are so small we don't show up there, but believe me, we're there on the map. And the conservation appeal of shaded coffee plantation, again, goes back to the structural complexity of that shade layer. As I said, if a farmer wants to grow different things, the shade can be made up of natural or trees out of that are native to the particular location, but also banana trees, citrus fruits, and what have you. And that's what we call polycultures. But that complexity is what confers or gives the plantations the ability to retain many forest attributes and thus ecosystem function and services. So we're kind of in the middle here, a middle ground, and part of those functions and services are enabled by the fact that these systems harbor high biodiversity. I want to mention also, which is where we're going now in the next second half of the presentation, that these attributes are also found in what we call modernized coffee plantations. And this is a management scheme that partially restores the shade layer in some plantations up to about 30–40% canopy cover. So it's sort of an in-between, a hybrid between trying to allow the grower to have higher productivity by higher incidence of sun radiation, but at the same time have preserved some of the attributes of a more strict shaded plantation. So that takes us again back to the island. You can see here, diagram. I hope you can see these polygons. These are reserves, federal and state. But this area is the one that we chose for our area because it does have a reserve. So we have our anchors, if you will, high biological diversity. And this sort of dark brownish, in my screen anyway, looks kind of mustard looking, is coffee cultivation. So you can see it dominates that. The other unique feature about this landscape is that there are a lot of NGOs that advocate for sustainable development in agriculture. So it's a really fertile ground in the sense of the public awareness of conservation initiatives and sustainability. And if you want to implement a conservation strategy, then this is a place to start because it facilitates. It minimizes the need to do environmental education, and we can and inform and go directly to farmers to see if they're interested in voluntarily participating in an initiative. The project had many tasks. I'll mention a few. Uh, we measuring landscape level attributes is difficult, but there are things that sort of provide some ideas, and those are, we call them biodiversity metrics. One of them is representation, and the other one is redundancy. So representation refers to the fact that you want to have areas that have as many species as there are to be have. And then redundancy is to have as many units containing as many we had across the landscape. The other one was that we estimated, abundance of amphibians and birds. Amphibians up here, we have, the tree frogs in Puerto Rico. We have 17 species of them. 15, 16 of them, no, 15 of them are endemic. Then we have, of course, we did birds, and that's one of them, what I'm emphasizing tonight. So here's the Puerto Rican toady. It's about the size of a wren, if you want to have some sense of how big it is. We also worked on the other end of the spectrum, and that is the agricultural end, so that we want to understand what are the things that interest or limit, constrain farmers. So we did quite a number of surveys. But I also had a student that worked on pollinators, insect pollinators, and worked on on how coffee is or is not benefited from this restoration of the shade versus sun. And so it's an important piece of information because it gives us the whole spectrum of values, if you will, in this whole idea. And what I'm highlighting here in red is response to management actions. If you remember, the definition for a conservation design is where to put things, or where to put actions on the landscape. And so we invested quite a bit of time on this one, and this is what I'll be talking about. We are supposed to conclude, and we will conclude by providing the agency a number of alternatives, and the decision makers are the ones that select the path that they think they can afford, that they can implement, etc. So there are a number of factors that go beyond the science, but I provide the best available science, ranked a portfolio of alternatives, and then they pick and choose. Okay, so here's the management action that we're focusing on. It's the Shade Restoration Program. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the USDA NRCS in the Caribbean have had this program since 2001. And it basically consists of an array of trees that are planted, 4 or 5 species that are planted in a particular array, a spatial array. It basically says 40 PS, which means 40 feet, how they are spaced. And they provide food and shelter for a number of biological species, but one of them in particular is specialized in the root system spreads out, and so it hangs on to the soil, so it prevents soil erosion. Another species is also a nitrogen fixer. So we have a mix of trees that provide a number of functions in the plantation, while at the same time providing the shade that we're looking for. Some guiding hypotheses, if you will. What do we expect? Well, in very simple, here are 2 simple examples. The whole idea of that array is that we sort of increase in shade, but at some point we level off, and we hope that that happens to be around 30, 40% cover. The other one is that the community should change a little bit, because when we started the project, we started essentially with a sun plantation, so open specialists should be the dominant group, whereas forest specialists are not. And as soon as complexity starts going, we should have a better balance, balance between both open habitat specialists and forest specialists. And that's very important. I'll mention it in a second, because the open habitat specialists tend to be insectivores, whereas the forest specialists tend to be frugivores and nectarivores. So we want both of those groups present in a system. So here's an illustration, a quick illustration of what what we're trying to achieve with these putting actions on the landscape. Here's an image, a satellite image from the mountainous region that I'm talking about, and there are several towns here. What if we grid out the area and we imagine that these grids, each one of these grid cells is a farm, and so we go out there and take some measurements as we did. So we have a benchmark value or landscape value. The next step is, okay, let's put some action on some management actions on the ground. So we say, let's intervene and do some shade restoration in 5 of those farms. What happens is that if you can appreciate that on your screen is that it lights up. Why? Because there's a new landscape value. That's the hope of implementing these actions in the landscape. You go further, then the next year you say, okay, I'm going to implement the same action in 7 additional farms. So the idea is that we start somewhere close to the sun, and then we do the restoration and we increase the shade cover, but we hang around. We are not quite all the way there to shade. We're not quite, obviously not quite down there. And we're sort of an intermediate value. So we see action, reward every time we implement our actions on an annual basis. Because the idea is to monitor what happens to the system so that you can make adjustments as you go. So let's see some results. Here's plantations on the left-hand side, 2004, the imagery. These farms were intervened or were accepted the restoration program from these agencies in 2003, I think it was, or 2003. And as you can see, they were still pretty much in the original state. Some plantations fairly open, wide open. By 2010, that's 10 years, you have quite a bit of shade. Fortunately, this shade cover was indeed around the 30 to 40. And we measure this over about 65 farms. So we had a really good sample size to get an idea of how well this program was acting. Ecological responses, I'll give you a couple of birds of the many that we evaluated. On the top, there's the yellow-faced grassquit. That's a finch. It's a ground dweller. Forages is a granivore, actually. On the bottom panel, we used to call it the striped-headed tanager. Still is striped, but now it's a Puerto Rican spendalis. I was elevated to a full species, endemic species in Puerto Rico. So the granivore open habitat specialist loves, as you can see, you have 5 years all the way to 10 years, and then this is forest. This is our reference. So we know how it compares to the reference, which is the secondary forest. So the granivores, as expected, they love the early stages of the restoration, but as soon as it starts getting thick and approaching the forest, then they don't like it quite as much. Of course, we don't want to emulate forest, so we don't get to this down level, but it tells you, it gives you an idea of reference, which is the idea. On the other hand, the frugivore doesn't quite like the open habitat. You have a tree here and there, but that's not quite what they like. But as soon as you hit the 6 to 10 year mark, and certainly beyond 10 years, it approaches the forest secondary. So even with a 30%, 40% of canopy cover, we're getting the presence, if you will, and this is measured as occupancy probability. It's the probability that you'll find an individual of a species, given that it's there to be detected. So you can see the frugivores also respond. So you have the intersection that you saw in that image that I showed before between forest specialists and open habitat specialists. Here's another one. This is an important one. This is what we call local extinction rates. We call it local because it only refers to the area that we're managing, that we're taking the action on. So I cannot extrapolate this to Puerto Rico. This is a local phenomenon. But we can measure, and extinction rates is the probability that a site that was occupied this year becomes unoccupied next year. So we want to prevent just that, right? So in this case here, you have another frugivore that it's the scallonate pigeon, a fairly large pigeon. It's about 15 inches long. For those of you that are familiar with pigeons in North America, it's very similar in size to the passenger pigeon, which went extinct because it was over harvested here in the US. But the point here is that as forest complexity increases, the probability of this individual to go extinct goes low because it gets forested. That's what it's looking for. On the other hand, you have the mockingbird, a species that you're well familiar with. It's an insectivore. It loves open habitat, not too crowded, not too dense. And as the forest cover increases, then we start losing them. The sites go from occupied to unoccupied. So what we need to strike here is the balance between the two. This concept is very important because if you subtract that probability, 1 minus extinction probability, it gives you the probability of persistence, local persistence. And that's what we want to enhance with landscape conservation. You want to make sure that whatever you are doing, action at a local level, you hang on to it for as long as you can. And this is why this is important. So going back to the original request from the head of the agency, the state agency, is increase landscape conservation value, but no habitat acquisition. Here are some answers. So how? Coffee farms provide the opportunities. Action, the shade restoration. That's our tool. This is what we're going to put on the landscape. Why? Well, we've got several reasons. It maximizes ecological services, which is one of the objectives. It minimizes soil erosion by selecting the trees that we plant, therefore improves water quality. It increases biodiversity, as we see, because it's sort of an intermediate, so we have the best of both worlds. Amphibians, birds, insect pollinators. We have biocontrol, so those are the insectivores. The amphibians serve as controlling pet species. Do not undermine coffee production and quality. This is an aspect that I'm not talking about. A student of mine worked on, and actually the quality, we had this tested with people that does this for a living, and they evaluate coffee quality, and ours, where the plant, like shaded coffee or the coffee generated in modernized plantations actually was marginally superior. It doesn't undermine production. And it promotes landscape level persistence, which is the other objective we wanted to accomplish. That is enhanced local persistence, as you saw from those graphs that I showed before. And if we go back to the panel, that remember the lower left, it enhances connectivity, because if you start planting, taking actions in that matrix between reserves, you smooth the matrix so things can move through. The permeability is increased. So again, where do we put shade restoration efforts? This is the decision part of the conservation design. So coffee farms offer the opportunity. Then we go into the science of where to put the shade restoration efforts. So one intuitive model, and this is, I brought it because I think it will make sense to everybody. What I did here is, you see the dark green blobs, for the lack of polygons, I'll be more sophisticated here. Is in the context of interest, right? And these dots, they're green by and large, are farms that NRCS or Fish and Wildlife Service has incentivized so that they implement what they call best management practices. However, not all of them have implemented or have restored shade, as we are talking about so far in this presentation. But look at this. What if, let's assume that these farms were all players. We put there what I call a halo. This distance of 500 meters around each one of these points, so it's a radius or diameter of 500 meters, is the distance that birds like to use, and I'm talking birds here, like to move from one habitat patch to another, from one farm to another. And as you can see, we already, if these farms were all participating in this program, we have already achieved quite a bit of connectivity. Now, there's some gaps, and we need to make some decisions. So let me give you some example. Let's take a look at these two reserves, and within that, and trust me, faith, but a little faith, but those of you that have high resolution color screens, there are red dots and there are blue. The blue dots are the farms that happen to have accepted the shade restoration program. Now, the reason they accepted that was because they were working with NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to prevent soil erosion, so that watersheds, the water going down the watershed from those headwaters will be clean and not affect reefs down below in the coast, which is 10 to 15 miles. So the proposition that I will make to these agencies is, why not include another objective and try to, and I call it flip NRCS farms, and that is touch base with these people that we already have communication with, explain what we're trying to do, and see if they, again, accept this is a voluntary program. And in doing so, if we, put enough of those dots, and we can figure out how many of those we would require, we can already have a head start in connecting two units, a large unit and a small unit. The other gaps, we can do so in order of priority, and we can prioritize those paths to enhance connectivity by costs, because obviously these programs cost money. They cost about $35,000 for a farm of, the average farm is about 25 hectares. The distance between reserves, which obviously influences costs. The size of the reserve, you may want to connect two small ones or a big one and small one. And the relative value of the reserve, and that all depends on the relative quality or the status condition, if you will, of each one of the reserve and what kind of management goes within those reserves. So there are ways that we can, again, populate the landscape with a really clear objective, set of objective, with using information on the one hand, and then design, optimizing, finding the best solutions given all of those constraints, and then achieve our objective of enhancing landscape ecological values and persistence for these species. So with that, I will stop, and I will be more than glad to entertain any questions. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you very much. I'm going to drop us out of screen share here. And again, thank you. This is really cool and interesting work. How long have you been doing this kind of conservation work, looking at Puerto Rico's shade, coffee, and conservation objectives?
Yeah, the shade coffee, I started out back in the late 90s for a whole bunch of different reasons. At that time, we were discovering the value, if you will, of shaded plantation. A number of other researchers throughout Central and South America were doing the same. Here in in the U.S., one Russell Greenberg was in particular, champion of this sort of research. And when he was with the Smithsonian, unfortunately, he passed away. So it dates back to the 90s, but it wasn't until 2015 that I started looking at it as a means to achieve an objective, a landscape level objective. And that's why we had to find not only document the real values at that scale, but also the mechanism to achieve those objectives. And I think we have a viable one. And so far there's interest, a lot of interest from the federal and state agencies to look into this and see if they can make it a reality.
I mean, it seems like a great way to not fence off parts of the island and make it unavailable for people to perform agriculture on,
Exactly.
but also increase biodiversity and endemic species.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Chris. And that is, we call it unprotected habitat. And in this particular case, it works. It's one way to, if you will, have a win-win, where you let the farmer do his thing, not under his bottom line, which is his, he needs to bring in the money to support the family, but also at the same time, gain the conservation value. And obviously, it takes a strain away from conservation dollars that could be directed to other priorities by state and federal agencies. So again, acquisition cannot be, even if we wanted to, cannot be and will not be the solution to the challenges that we are facing these days. It's just too expensive, and they're alternative, but we need to make sure that they work and that they're viable, affordable, if you will. And I think this one is in many ways. I mean, there's an investment, but we don't have to invest forever. It's a one-time deal. Go in, and hopefully they'll keep it in that way, because that's part of the deal. That once they enter into this agreement, they should keep it and keep shade around 30-40%, and we have people that actually go and advise those farmers to keep it so.
I'll remind everybody, if you have questions or comments you want to make, put those in the chat and we'll moderate and facilitate those to our guest speaker tonight. Tell me a little bit about adoption. You just mentioned that a lot of growers are really interested in this program. And you mentioned real briefly that the quality and quantity of their product isn't negatively impacted.
Right.
So why aren't all of the coffee farms in Puerto Rico shade grown coffee?
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of the reason is, and we learned this through our surveys with coffee, with growers, with farmers. Part of the reason is that there are two schools of thoughts, put it that way. One is the one that pushes productivity at all costs, literally, and so therefore you have the more intense, which is some plantations, the intense coffee cultivation. And then on the other hand, you have the shade coffee cultivation, which is less intense. So productivity and the sun is higher because, again, you're on the sun, you're not shaded. The only thing is again, that as I show pictures, is that soil erosion will ensue, unfortunately, and you have to compensate by using agrochemicals, fertilizers, and other kinds of pesticides, because you're removing the biocontrols. On the other hand, the shade used to be obviously the dominant type of plantation in Puerto Rico, certainly in the 18th and in the 19th and 20th century. But it's lower production, but the quality. People look for it, and here in the Triangle area, people actually look for shade. It's a very valued commodity. The last thing that I'll say, which really is the bottom line, is that because the government, there's a faction in the government that pushes the sun, there are a lot of incentives that are tied in with that kind of cultivation. There are a number of others which are far fewer for shade. Again, most of people in government want to push production. So when you have that competition, farmers find themselves, and that's what they told them. They have a hybrid farm where they have a few parcels or a few chunks of it under shade, and a few chunks of them under sun, so they can double dip, if you will, the incentives, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to hack it. The other questions have to do, or the other limiting factors, constraint has to do with market, how to get those products out to the market, and that's what's beyond the scope of the study. But we learned that is a limiting factor for farmers. So there are a lot of sort of socioeconomic pressures or forces operating here, even though everybody, when you talk to them, they do appreciate and recognize, especially the farmers, the old timers, if you will, that they get all kinds of benefits from biocontrol and the quality and what have you.
Excellent stuff. All right, I'm gonna go over here to the chat and grab some questions from there. In fact, this one is relevant to what you were just saying. Somebody's asking, user HNM, do we have any local importers that are supporting the initiative? I'm going to assume local to North Carolina.
Right. Yeah, there's, what is it called? The counterculture, I think it is. There's some groups. You see them represented in Whole Foods, places like Whole Foods, but there are other distributors. I mean, the key, I guess, to think about in terms of what the Smithsonian has been trying to do for years is to have these farms certified as coffee friendly or environmentally friendly farms. So they have these certifications. So if you look for those labels in your coffee, then you're assured that you're getting what you're paying for. Not only shade, but probably organic shade, which is even probably a more valued by some consumers. So look for those kinds of identifying markers. Otherwise, the truth is, again, it goes back to the market. Big companies, I won't mention any names, go for everything. They go for the gusto. So you have farmers that bring sun-grown, shade-grown, anything grown, and they throw them all together in the mix, and that's what you get sometimes. So you have to be selective, but you can sponsor or incentivize, if you will, by your consuming certified coffee. That's sort of that practice. Uh, and again, our approach here is to take advantage of the receptivity of the federal agencies and some sectors of the state agencies to promote what we're talking about. It's just in between where production is enhanced because it's not fully shaded, but you also get the benefits of the shade plantation. So we're looking for that, negotiating that space, if you will, finding that compromise so that we can make it a win-win.
All right. Sarah says, this is a really neat project. What a neat project, Sarah wrote. Are many of the farms owned by individuals or are they larger operations?
There is a little bit of both. We're losing, and we learned that back in 2012, that what we're seeing is a turnover. So you have the old timers, the original owners of these farms, as economy in Puerto Rico went from an agricultural one to a more industrial ones, and that happened around the 50s. Before that, it was really heavily dependent on agriculture. These farmers are growing old. The kids have grown, have gone to college, have come down from the mountains, so to speak. And as they gain education, they want other jobs. And what we see is a lot of turnover. They either sell it or the production, they keep production, but they sell it to these big buyers so that they don't have to hassle with the market. So unfortunately, we see this turnover. Now, having said that, that's sort of the macro picture. There's now, I would say, with this more recent, that was 2012 survey. Our survey was done in, I think it was 2015 and 16. There's a new crop of folks that are interested in sustained agriculture, organic agriculture. And they do come from the college, from College of Agriculture, much like NC State, College of Agriculture. And they are the new generation, and they are the ones pushing the gourmet coffee, as we call it, the shade grown or partial shade. They call it semi-shade. And I'm hopeful that that new generation will be the spearhead of what we're looking for. They express willingness to participate, but as you would expect, being better educated, they want to know what they're getting in return and know more about what everybody's gaining. And this is where this study sort of fills in the gap, that we have the information now both from the ecology, but also from the point of view of pollinators and coffee production, that we can provide these more sophisticated, farmers the information to help them make a decision. Again, all of this is being voluntary.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, let me see. Questions are rolling in here. Karen is asking, in addition to the shade canopy above the coffee layer, is there a ground cover component of low growing plants, or does that interfere with coffee production?
No, it doesn't interfere. The farmers like to keep it controlled, and they use, again, the old timers prefer the machete. The newer generations may actually use some agrochemicals to keep it in check. The good thing is that the shade itself helps keep the understory or that low vegetation and more or less in check. I mean, it grows and you have to keep it, and that's why it's manageable if you use the machete. Obviously, that's not the case on the sun plantation, and you see the herbicides being used more heavily. But I'm sorry to say that it's not perfect. The machete is not always the instrument of preference. And there's no, and because labor is expensive in Puerto Rico. Remember, Puerto Rico is part of the US. So compared to, say, the Dominican Republic or Cuba, where you don't have to pay, minimum wages or anything like it, then people will opt to, rather than spending 2, 3, 4, 5 days with a machete, they'll go with a sprayer and then take care of business. So, there's always, again, back and forth, and but the idea is to minimize that use of herbicides for that understory growth.
Bob is asking, Bob says they've heard that coffee farms in other countries have had difficulties. Is the coffee market strong enough to maintain these farms over time?
Um, yeah, I mean, again, and what creates the pressure is mostly the push for the sun-grown coffee, the intensive managed coffee plantations, which are striving for productivity, and then production, high production in short term, high yields, short term, and then the companies, the big companies that are pushing for that short-term reward. So it's hard for these people to survive, especially in these other countries. I mean, we have the luxury, again, because we're in the U.S., of having use the word incentives. That is not the case in these other countries. So they really have to hack it on their own pretty much. So there's a disparity. So they see the money on the rapid growth or the high yield sun plantations, and you see the imbalance. And again, that's the concept of modernized coffee plantations. That stuff that I just talked, the shade restoration, actually was originated in Central America, in Costa Rica, and that's spreading over because they are looking for ways to entice or appeal to the farmers, saying you may still have some achieve higher yield, but retain the value, the conservation value of your plantation. But again, somebody has to give out the trees. We have a means to do that in Puerto Rico, but in Central South America, it may be a different, different story and a challenge. So it's a challenge. So no ifs and buts about it.
So it sounds like the way to keep the shade grown coffee market strong is to buy shade grown coffee.
Exactly, right. And then if you do the certification thing, it's one way. I mean, people do, I'm being candid here, people do complain that certification is so strict that some farmers say, no, I don't want to even mess with that because I can't meet all the requirements. But I think they're working on, I don't want to use the word relaxing, it's not the word I'm looking for, but making it easier for farmers to meet or achieve a minimum set of standards, so that at least we meet a minimum set of conservation values or benefits.
Excellent. Okay, Allie is asking, we'll talk about the birds now. What species that is attracted to these newly shaded areas would you say is the most beneficial for the farmers to have on their land?
Um, okay, ironically, there are two. Well, you have to on the two sides. Why did I throw in included the mockingbird or even the kingbird? I mean, we have kingbirds, we have flycatchers, we have the whole works. The reason we included those two was generally you would consider, really common species. Some people would even go as low, and I don't, as trash species, right? But because they're so common, right? But a colleague of mine, actually a former student of mine, doing some studies on frugivory and seed dispersal, discover that when areas are denuded, like some coffee plantations, the guys that bring the seed from the forest are those guys that use the open habitat. And the two protagonists were the mockingbird and the gray kingbird. So that's on the one hand. So they do have a role, seed dispersal, especially in the early stages of the shade, the increasing. Then on the other side, you want to keep what? The frugivores doing the same thing, dispersing and controlling pests. So the insectivores do the pest control mostly, but you have also the seed dispersal by the frugivores. So it's a complement. Everybody's doing something for the team, if you will, for the benefit of the greater good. And it's just the emphasis of each group. Each group sort of emphasizes their impact depending on the stage that you are. And this intermediate stage sort of brings together the best of both of these groups.
I was thinking, I had a similar question. about the actual wildlife, about the birds, which was, are these forest species in general more at risk of becoming endangered or extinction than, I mean, I know than the mockingbirds. I've got all kinds of
Right,
mockingbirds right here in my front
right,
yard.
right.
Welcome to them.
Yes.
But uh, right, is the loss of forest cover uh, so dramatic as to be driving extinctions?
Right. Okay. Let me see if I put this answer in historic perspective. Puerto Rico went through a severe period of deforestation in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, up to the 1930s. The reason? Agriculture. The island really became a sugarcane farm. The only places that were not covered with sugarcane were the higher elevation where coffee used to be planted because you have higher quality humidity and the temperature, which is required for these plantations. Not the sun. You can get away with some species. It's called robusta coffee in lower elevations. But the point I'm trying to make is that given that history of deforestation in Puerto Rico, which is also true for the rest of the Caribbean islands, uh, the expectation, so researchers came back in the 80s and looked at that and looked at the number of species that were endangered or went extinct. And they asked themselves, how come reality doesn't match predictions? And the answer for that was, and this is a hypothesis that has been there, and I think we've now shown how that works, is that shade coffee plantation, which was the second most uh, commodity or cultivation type in Puerto Rico, especially in the high elevations, and it was shaded. It wasn't all open. I mean, that thing didn't exist at those in those days. Served as the refuge for our species, native species, while the going was going tough. So it really ameliorated, it buffered what you would have expected had you not had shaded coffee. Now, that role sort of subsided, went down as we moved towards industrialization. Sugarcane disappeared eventually by the 60s and early 70s in Puerto Rico. Guess what? All of that land, a lot of it had secondary forest grow back. So we went from about 6% forest cover on the island, around 6 to 10%, depending on the expert you ask, around the 1930s to 55%. And nowadays in 2017, the last report, well, the land cover was from 2011. So that's a whopping change. So on the other hand, you had coffee, now competing between sun and shade. So the role has diminished, if you will, but it served a role of, again, ameliorating extinction rates back in the 20th century. This trend, however, of reforestation is not observed in the rest of the Caribbean islands. We are an anomaly. So Puerto Rico is really a nice place to understand how land cover changes influence fauna and flora, for that matter. I'm not even talking about trees here, but it gives you an idea of the dynamics. And I'll say one last thing, and this is a long-winded answer, so I apologize for that, is that coffee still has a role. Even though we're gaining all this forest cover, and we gain it, it's there, for two reasons. One, we go back to the human footprint. Growing, we're still expanding. Urban sprawl in Puerto Rico is going all over creation. So it's a matter of, so we're fragmenting that forest more and taking over. And two, interestingly enough, a recent study published in 2017 showed that human dwellings, houses, urbanized areas, like to be close to protected areas because it's nice. Your backyard is like here in the Smokies. Let's have a house right there on the edge, the Smokies. My backdrop is a forest, a reserve. The issue with that is that you create a halo, if you allow me the analogy, a halo, if you will, of habitat that is sort of hostile to movement in and out of the reserve. So you're basically isolating those reserves. So again, our argument is that shaded plantation or restore shade plantations can still play a role because we're losing what we gain, and the protected areas that we have are being surrounded by these human dwellings, and therefore the movement back and forth reduces, and then you exacerbate problems like local extinction and so on and so forth. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but I needed to give you sort of the timeline perspective of
Hmm.
how coffee comes and goes in conservation in Puerto Rico.
No, that was perfect because that really sort of looking back into the 19th and early 20th century really sets the stage for understanding that. No, that was amazing. Perfect answer. Okay, there was one more question in the chat box, so I'm going to go ahead and get to it, even though I'm over time on us now. But Glenn was asking, does shade grown coffee sell for a higher price that makes up for the productivity difference with sun?
Technically, it does. I mean, they call it gourmet coffee for that reason. And some people, again, this new batch of growers that are highly educated, they have an ag degree and so on and so forth. Many of them master's degree. Uh, that's all they do, grow this gourmet coffee, because they have people that actually in San Juan and elsewhere will actually buy it, so they know where to sell it. And actually the fact that you pay higher price here if you go to Whole Foods or any other place and get this gourmet coffee or certified coffee gives you an idea that people, the alkaloids, caffeine levels, everything is, everything that makes you happy when you take a cup of coffee you get an extra kick out of the Shadegrown, and that's the quality I was referring to. We actually collected beans of coffee with our student that evaluated this, and we grew them with pollination, artificial pollination, or natural pollination. I mean, she did a beautiful set of experiments. Incidentally, her name is Sarah, and I wonder if the one that posed the question was her. So, but what she did is we collected those berries under different treatments, and we discovered that those that are, pollinated, bee pollinated, and grown into the with shade, the restore shade was actually a better quality based on 13 or 15 experts that do this for a living. I mean, they actually do it like the wine tasting. They do it for coffee, if you believe it or not. And they ranked the different, because this is like a blind experiment. Nobody knew where anything came from. So they tasted it, and lo and behold, our stuff came out on top. So it goes to show that it does indeed have better quality, tasting quality. So it should be, that's why it sells.
All right. Well, Jaime, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
This was a fantastic presentation, and it's definitely going to change the way I have my cup of coffee tomorrow morning. I think
Yeah,
I'll be thinking through all of this.
right. So
Maybe not too early, but
yeah, and thank you, Chris, the museum, and everybody that was able to tune in. Keep safe, and hope to see you sometime soon. Hopefully in person next time around.
absolutely. Yes, take care, everybody. And since we had a little hiccup in the beginning, I want to let everybody know that we've launched a survey. That's right. We want your feedback, your opinions on how we're doing with this virtual science cafe format. So this program represents our 10th, I think, our ninth virtual science cafe. And we want to know what you think about the show. So I'm going to drop a link to the survey in the chat box, but it should also pop up here on screen. So if you've got a pencil and a piece of paper handy, you can scribble it down, hit up the link, and let us know your thoughts about our program. We want to make sure we're bringing you the best science content, most engaging stuff that we can out of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. So there you have it, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed this program, and take care. I hope we'll see you again real soon here at the Virtual Science Cafe every Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night, everybody. Thank you.